Imagine you're given a choice: drink poison and die, or abandon everything you believe is true and live. What do you choose? Because that's not hypothetical. Socrates faced exactly this decision. The city of Athens told him, stop asking questions, stop making people uncomfortable, stop exposing our ignorance, or we'll kill you. He chose death. He drank the hemlock. Why would someone choose to die rather than just shut up? That question haunted me for years, until I realized he wasn't dying for ideas. He was dying because he discovered something so powerful about how to live that betraying it would be worse than death itself. And that same discovery is available to you right now, today, in this video. But I have to warn you, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You've been taught that knowledge is about accumulating facts, that wisdom is about having answers, and that confidence means being certain. So you read, you study, you try to become smart enough to figure out your life. But the more you learn, the more lost you feel. You have opinions about everything but clarity about nothing. You can debate, but you can't decide. You know what you're supposed to want, but you don't know what you actually want. And here's the painful part. Everyone around you seems to have it figured out. They speak with authority. They move with confidence. They seem so sure. And you wonder what's wrong with you. Why can't you just pick a lane and commit? Here's what I've learned studying Socrates for years, and here's what changed everything for me. The people who seem most certain are often the most confused. They've just stopped questioning. They've calcified around beliefs they inherited, opinions they absorbed, desires that were handed to them. And they call that confidence, but Socrates would call it something else: slavery. Slavery to unexamined ideas. Because when you're certain, you've stopped growing. When you're certain, you've stopped learning. When you're certain, you're essentially dead while still breathing. Now here's the lie you've been sold: that wisdom comes from filling your mind, from reading more books, taking more courses, listening to more podcasts, accumulating more facts. Socrates discovered the opposite is true. Wisdom comes from emptying your mind, from unlearning, from questioning everything you think you know until you hit bedrock, the few things that are actually undeniably real. Most people never do this. They spend their whole lives rearranging furniture in a house they never chose. They're so busy optimizing their lives that they never stop to ask whether they're optimizing for the right things. And that's the core pain, isn't it? You're exhausted from pretending. You're tired of defending positions you're not even sure you believe. You're worn out from keeping up appearances, from performing confidence, from acting like you have it all figured out when inside you're drowning in uncertainty. And the worst part? You think that it means there's something wrong with you, that you're not smart enough, not disciplined enough, not evolved enough. But what if, and stay with me here, what if your uncertainty is actually your wisdom trying to break through? What if your confusion is your soul saying, stop, look at what we're doing. Is this really ours? What if the thing you've been treating as a weakness is actually your greatest strength? This is what this video delivers. This isn't a history lesson about some dead Greek guy. This is a rewiring of how you think, how you question, how you live. I'm going to show you Socrates' method for cutting through the noise, the performance, the inherited beliefs that are running your life without your permission. You'll learn why "I don't know" is the most powerful sentence in the human language, why questions matter more than answers, Why making people uncomfortable, including yourself, is an act of love. And why the life Socrates lived, the one he died for, is the same one you're secretly craving. A life that's actually yours. Every other video about Socrates will tell you what he thought. I'm going to show you how he thought and how you can think that way too. We're going to practice the Socratic method together. I'm going to ask you questions that will make you uncomfortable. And by the end, you'll understand why Socrates said the unexamined life isn't worth living, because you'll have tasted what the examined life feels like. And there's no going back from that. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you taste that freedom, that clarity, that sense of living from your actual values instead of borrowed ones, you can't go back to sleep. So let's begin. And I want to start not with philosophy, not with abstract concepts, but with the man himself, because Socrates' life is the argument. Everything he taught, he lived. Everything he believed, he was willing to die for. And if you understand his life, you'll understand why his ideas have survived 2,400 years and why they matter more now than ever. Before we get into the method, the philosophy, the practical tools, I need you to understand who Socrates was. Not as a marble statue or a textbook figure, as a human being. Because his life is the argument. Let me paint you three pictures. Socrates walked around Athens barefoot, wearing the same ragged cloak every day. He was short, ugly by Greek standards, snub-nosed, bulging eyes, pot-belly. He looked like a satyr, one of those half-man, half-goat creatures from Greek mythology. And he had no job, no income. He just wandered the marketplace, the gymnasiums, the symposiums, asking people questions. His wife, Xanthippe, is described in historical texts as shrewish and difficult, probably because she was married to a man who contributed nothing financially to the household and spent his days philosophically harassing strangers. Can you imagine? Your husband comes home every day having earned nothing, contributed nothing. Practical, just full of stories about how he made some politician look foolish in public. But here's what's beautiful about this. Socrates didn't care. He had discovered something more valuable than money, more valuable than reputation, more valuable than comfort. He had discovered a way of thinking that made him feel fully alive. And once you taste that, everything else becomes background noise. Picture this scene with me. It's a hot afternoon in Athens. The agora, the marketplace, is bustling. Merchants selling olives, pottery, fabric. Politicians giving speeches. Young men training for athletic competitions. And there in the middle of all this activity is Socrates, barefoot, shabby, probably smelling a bit ripe in the Mediterranean heat. And he approaches a wealthy young man, someone dressed in expensive robes, surrounded by admirers. This young man is holding court, talking about virtue, about honor, about what makes a good life. He's confident, articulate. Everyone's nodding along. And this homeless-looking man shuffles up and says, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear. What do you mean by virtue?" The young man looks annoyed. You can almost see him thinking, who is this peasant interrupting my moment? He says, everyone knows what virtue is. It's living honorably, doing the right thing. And Socrates smiles, this infuriating, gentle smile, and says, I'm sure you're right, but I'm a bit slow. Could you explain it to me? What is the right thing? Is it the same in all situations? The young man, now slightly irritated, says, well, it depends on the situation. And Socrates lights up. So virtue changes based on circumstances? But then how do we know what virtue is if it's always changing? The young man shifts his weight. Well, there are principles, and Socrates interrupts gently. What principles? Can you name them? And for the next hour, this continues. Simple questions. Is virtue the same for a soldier and a farmer? Can someone be virtuous without knowing it? Is it better to seem virtuous or to be virtuous? If someone doesn't know what virtue is, can they still practice it? And slowly, painfully, you watch the young man's entire worldview collapse. His certainty cracks. His smooth answers start contradicting each other. And he realizes, with a mixture of horror and humiliation, that he's been using this word his entire life without understanding what it means. He's been performing virtue, talking about virtue, judging others' virtue, all while having no clear idea what virtue actually is. Now, here's what most people miss about this story. Socrates isn't trying to humiliate this young man. He's not trying to win an argument. He's trying to wake him up, because that young man was asleep. He was walking through life on autopilot, repeating phrases he'd heard, pursuing goals he'd been told to pursue, believing things he'd never examined. And Socrates, in his infinite compassion, is trying to shake him awake. This is what Socrates understood that most of us don't. Most people are asleep. They're repeating scripts. They've never stopped to ask why they believe what they believe, want what they want, fear what they fear. They're like actors who've forgotten they're in a play. They think the script is reality. And the way you wake someone up isn't by telling them they're wrong. That just makes them defensive. The way you wake someone up is by asking them questions until they discover it themselves, until they hear their own contradictions, until they realize they've been pretending. Socrates didn't have students in the traditional sense. He had conversation partners. He didn't give lectures. He gave question marks. He didn't hand out answers. He took away false certainties. And the people who hated him most, they were the ones who realized they'd been pretending their whole lives, because that's a painful realization. That's an ego death. And most people will do anything to avoid it. Think about it for a moment. When was the last time someone asked you a question that actually made you think? Not a polite question, not small talk. A real question. A question that got under your skin, that made you question your assumptions, that revealed a contradiction in your thinking. Most of us go years, decades without that experience. We're surrounded by people who already agree with us, algorithms that feed us content we want to see, systems designed to make us feel certain, validated, comfortable. We've built echo chambers so effective that we never have to confront our own ignorance. Socrates would look at our world and weep, because certainty is the enemy of wisdom, and we're more certain than ever. We've never had more information at our fingertips, and we've never been more confused. We've never had more opinions, and we've never had less understanding. We scroll through social media getting more and more convinced that we're right and everyone else is stupid, and we call that being informed. Socrates would call it something else: voluntary blindness. Here's the thing that breaks my heart. We've forgotten how to be uncertain together. We've forgotten how to sit with not knowing. We've forgotten how to say, I don't understand, without feeling ashamed. And because of that, we've stopped growing. We've calcified. We've become brittle. And when reality inevitably challenges our beliefs, we either break or we double down on the delusion. Socrates spent his life trying to prevent this. He was like a doctor who sees everyone around him dying of a disease they don't know they have, and his cure, his only cure, was awareness, questions, examination. The painful, uncomfortable work of looking clearly at what you believe and asking, is this true? How do I know? What if I'm wrong? And here's what makes this story even more powerful. Socrates didn't charge money for this. He wasn't building a business. He wasn't trying to become famous. He was doing it because he could not do it. He had tasted the freedom of living an examined life, and he wanted everyone else to taste it too. He was like someone who discovered fire trying to share it with people living in darkness. And most of them preferred the darkness because at least it was familiar. Now let me tell you the second story, and this one's going to hurt a little. This is where Socrates' commitment to truth cost him everything. Socrates was 70 years old when Athens put him on trial. 70. Most people at that age are thinking about retirement, grandchildren, taking it easy. Socrates had spent decades doing the same thing, walking around Athens asking questions, challenging assumptions, making powerful people uncomfortable, and finally they'd had enough. The charges were corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, but everyone knew what the trial was really about. He'd embarrassed too many people. He'd asked too many questions. He'd exposed too much ignorance in too many powerful men, and they wanted him gone. So picture this, a courtroom in ancient Athens. 501 citizens, ordinary people, not professional judges, sitting as a jury. And in front of them stands Socrates, old, poor, dressed in his usual shabby cloak. His friends are terrified. They're begging him to be humble, to apologize, to beg for mercy. All he has to do is show some contrition, promise to stop philosophizing, and he'll probably get a slap on the wrist, maybe a fine, maybe exile. But Socrates does the most Socratic thing possible. He tells them they should be thanking him. He stands there in front of 500 people who hold his life in their hands, and he says, essentially, you've got this backwards. I'm the best thing that ever happened to this city. I'm like a gadfly sent by the gods to sting Athens awake. This city is like a noble but lazy horse, and without me constantly biting it, constantly irritating it, it would fall into a deep sleep. Can you imagine the audacity? Can you imagine standing in front of your accusers and telling them you're doing them a favor? And then he does something even more outrageous. His accusers give speeches about why he's dangerous, why he needs to be punished. And instead of defending himself the normal way, Socrates cross-examines them. Right there in the trial, he starts asking them questions. What do you mean by corrupting the youth? Can you give me an example? Do you think I'm doing this intentionally or unintentionally? If unintentionally, shouldn't you educate me rather than punish me? If intentionally, why would I want to make the people around me worse? Wouldn't that harm me too? He's applying the Socratic method to his own trial. He's philosophizing his way through his own execution hearing. The jury is stunned. His friends are horrified. This was supposed to be his chance to save himself, and instead he's doing the exact thing they're accusing him of. Making people uncomfortable, exposing their faulty reasoning, refusing to just accept the conventional wisdom. And you can almost hear his friends thinking, Socrates, please, for once in your life, just shut up and play the game. But he can't. Or rather, he won't. Because playing the game would mean betraying everything he's discovered. It would mean admitting that comfort is more important than truth, that survival is more important than integrity, that going along to get along is more important than living according to your actual values. And Socrates has spent his entire life proving the opposite. They vote guilty. The margin is actually pretty close. If just 30 people had voted differently, he would have been acquitted. But the verdict is guilty. Now comes the sentencing. Under Athenian law, the prosecution proposes a penalty, the defense proposes a counterpenalty, and the jury votes on which one to impose. The prosecution proposes death. Socrates' friends are frantic. All he has to do is propose something reasonable, exile, a fine, anything, and he'll probably get that instead. The jury doesn't really want to kill him. They just want him to stop being so damn annoying. And what does Socrates propose? He suggests, and I'm not making this up, that the city should reward him with free meals for life at the Prytaneum, a huge honor usually reserved for Olympic champions and war heroes. He's essentially saying, not only should you not punish me, you should treat me like a national treasure. His reasoning? He spent his life making Athens better, making people think, improving the city through philosophy. Why should he be punished for that? Why not rewarded? The jury is furious now. They see this as mockery, as arrogance. They vote again, and this time, more people vote for death than had voted for guilt in the first place. They sentence him to drink hemlock, a poison that would slowly paralyze his body until he stopped breathing. And even then, even after being sentenced to death, Socrates remains calm. He tells the jury, no evil can happen to a good person, either in life or in death. He's not upset. He's not angry. He's at peace. Now here's where this story becomes almost unbearable in its beauty. Socrates has 30 days before the execution. Athens had a law that no one could be executed during a certain religious festival. His friends, desperate to save him, bribe the guards. They arrange for him to escape. They have a plan. All he has to do is leave the prison, flee Athens, and live out his days somewhere else. He could teach. He could philosophize. He could live. But Socrates refuses. He spends his last night in prison. And do you know what he does? He philosophizes. His friends are crying, begging him to escape, and he's asking them questions about the nature of the soul, whether death is something to fear, what it means to live a good life. He's comforting them. One friend, Crito, makes an impassioned plea. He tells Socrates that everyone will think they didn't try hard enough to save him, that people will judge them for letting their friend die. And Socrates asks him, why do we care what everyone thinks? Shouldn't we only care what truth demands? Shouldn't we only care what's actually right? He makes an argument that goes something like this. I've spent my entire life teaching people to respect the laws, to be good citizens, to not run away when things get difficult. If I escape now, I'm contradicting everything I've taught. I'm showing that when the laws don't go my way, I'll just ignore them. What kind of example is that? What kind of integrity is that? And besides, he says, what am I running from? Death is either nothingness, in which case it's like a peaceful sleep, or it's a transition to another realm where I can continue asking questions, maybe even question the great thinkers of the past. Either way, why fear it? And then comes the final moment. They bring him the cup of hemlock. His friends are sobbing. He takes it calmly. He asks the executioner for instructions. How should he drink it? What should he expect? The executioner is amazed at his composure. Most people are hysterical at this point. Socrates drinks the poison. He walks around a bit as instructed, then lies down. The poison starts in his feet and slowly works its way up. He can feel his legs going numb, then his torso. His friends are holding him, weeping. And his last words, he tells his friend Crito, "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Make sure you pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing, and people would sacrifice a rooster when they recovered from an illness. Socrates' final statement is that death is a healing, a cure for the sickness of life. And then he's gone. Now, why am I telling you this story in such detail? Why does this matter? Because here's the thing about Socrates that most people miss. He wasn't a martyr. He wasn't trying to make a grand statement. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He simply couldn't live any other way. He had tasted what it felt like to live an examined life, to think clearly, to refuse to pretend, to prioritize truth over comfort. And once you taste that, everything else feels like death. The real death isn't the hemlock. The real death is going back to sleep, going back to pretending, going back to living a life someone else designed for you. Socrates died free, not physically. He was executed by the state. But internally, he was more free than anyone in that jury because he wasn't afraid. He wasn't compromising. He wasn't betraying himself to survive. And there's something in all of us that recognizes that freedom and craves it desperately. We spend our lives trading authenticity for safety, truth for approval, integrity for comfort. And we die a little bit every day from those trades. Socrates is showing us another way, a harder way, a way that might cost you everything, but a way that lets you sleep peacefully at night because you know you're living according to what's actually true. Now, I'm not saying you need to die for your beliefs. I'm not saying you need to be a martyr, but I am asking, what are you willing to lose to live honestly? Your reputation, your comfort, your certainty? Because here's what Socrates proved. The things we think will destroy us, being wrong, being questioned, being uncertain, those are actually the things that set us free. It's the clinging, the defending, the pretending that kills us slowly from the inside. Let me tell you the third story, and this one's going to tie everything together. This story isn't from Socrates' life. It's from his most famous student, Plato. But it captures everything Socrates taught. Socrates himself never wrote anything down. He didn't trust writing. He thought it would make people lazy, make them stop thinking for themselves, make them memorize words instead of understanding ideas. Everything we know about Socrates comes from his students, primarily Plato. And Plato wrote this allegory, the allegory of the cave, that's basically Socrates' entire philosophy in story form. Here's how it goes. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since childhood. They're facing a wall, and they can't turn their heads. They've been there so long, they don't even remember there's anything else. Behind them, there's a fire burning. And between the fire and the prisoners, there's a raised walkway where people carry objects, statues, furniture, tools. These objects cast shadows on the wall that the prisoners are facing. Now, the prisoners have been watching these shadows their entire lives. This is their reality. They've given the shadows names. They've developed a whole language around the shadows. They can predict which shadow will appear next based on patterns they've observed. They have shadow experts who are really good at predicting the shadow sequences, and these experts are respected and honored. The prisoners have built their entire understanding of reality, their entire civilization based on shadows. Then one day, one prisoner breaks free. Maybe the chains rust through. Maybe he's just more curious than the others, but he manages to turn around. And for the first time in his life, he sees the fire. He sees the people carrying objects. He realizes that the shadows, everything he thought was real, are just projections. They're not reality. They're reflections of reality. And this realization is devastating. Everything he knew is wrong. His entire framework for understanding the world just collapsed, and it's painful. The light from the fire hurts his eyes. He's disoriented. Part of him wants to turn back around, face the wall, go back to the comfortable familiarity of the shadows. But he doesn't. He stumbles toward the mouth of the cave, and then he emerges into sunlight, and it's blinding. It's agonizing. He has to close his eyes. He can barely see. For a while, he can only look at reflections in water, shadows of trees. Slowly, painfully, his eyes adjust. And then he sees it. The actual world. Trees, sky, mountains, the sun. Reality itself, not shadows of reality. He's euphoric. He's seen the truth, and immediately his first thought is, I have to go back. I have to tell the others. I have to free them. So he runs back into the cave, back into the darkness. And now his eyes, adjusted to sunlight, can't see in the darkness. He's stumbling around, bumping into things. And the prisoners watching him think he's gone insane. They see him struggling and conclude the journey outside destroyed him. Going beyond the shadows made him blind and foolish. He tries to tell them, you don't understand. The shadows aren't real. There's a whole world out there. Fire, sunlight, trees, reality. And they think he's lost his mind. They're comfortable with their shadows. They've built their entire lives around the shadows. They have shadow careers, shadow relationships, shadow meaning. And this madman is telling them it's all fake. He's telling them everything they know is wrong. They don't just reject him, they threaten him. Plato says if they could get their hands on him, they would kill him. Because he's not just questioning their beliefs, he's questioning their entire reality. Now let's translate this. You are in the cave right now as you're watching this. The shadows are the beliefs you inherited from your parents, your culture, your education, your trauma, your algorithms, your peer group. You think they're reality. You've built your entire identity around them. You've never questioned them because questioning them feels like questioning reality itself. You want success? That's a shadow. What does success even mean? Who defined it? Why do you want it? You're afraid of failure? That's a shadow. What is failure? Who decided what counts as failure? Why does it scare you? You believe you're not enough. That's a shadow. Not enough for what? According to whom? Based on what standard? And someone, maybe me in this video, maybe Socrates in a book, maybe that quiet voice inside you is saying, turn around, look at the fire, walk toward the light. And it hurts. It's disorienting. It feels like dying. Because in a way it is. The person you thought you were, that's a shadow. The person you actually are, that's the thing casting the shadow. But you've been looking at the shadow for so long, you forgot there's a difference. Here's what kills me about this allegory. Most people never leave the cave. They die watching shadows. They spend their entire lives in the dark, mistaking projections for reality, never once turning around to see what's actually there. And it's not because they're stupid or weak. It's because turning around requires courage. It requires being willing to be temporarily blind. It requires being willing to have everything you know be wrong. It requires being willing to lose your place in the cave society, your status as a shadow expert, your comfort in knowing where you are, even if where you are is prison. The people who leave the cave don't do it because they have more information. They do it because they're willing to be uncertain. They're willing to be uncomfortable. They're willing to look foolish for a while in service of eventually seeing clearly. And here's the secret. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you've seen sunlight, shadows can never satisfy you again. Once you've tasted truth, you can't go back to comfortable lies. Socrates knew this. That's why he was willing to die rather than stop questioning. Because going back to the cave, going back to the shadows, going back to pretending, that would be worse than death. So here's the question that will change everything. What if everything you're certain about is just a shadow? What if the life you think you want was designed by someone else? What if your fear of being wrong is the only thing keeping you in the cave? Socrates spent his entire life trying to get people to turn around, not because he had the answers, not because he knew what was outside the cave, but because he knew you can't find truth in the darkness. You have to be willing to be blinded by the light first. You have to be willing to stumble. You have to be willing to look like a fool. And most people aren't. Most people would rather die in the comfortable dark than live in the uncomfortable light. But you're different. You're watching this video. You're already questioning. You're already turning around. You've already felt that discomfort that means you're waking up. So let's not waste that. Let's go deeper. Let's talk about what Socrates actually discovered. What are the core lessons? What did he figure out that's still true today, that's still useful, that's still life-changing? I'm going to break this down into 7 truths. 7 ideas that sound simple, but will rewire how you see everything. The first lesson, the foundation of everything, is this. I know that I know nothing. This is the most famous thing Socrates ever said, and it's the most misunderstood. People think it's false humility, like he's fishing for compliments. Oh, I don't know anything. Please tell me I'm smart. That's not what he meant at all. He meant it literally. And here's how he arrived at it. The oracle at Delphi. Think of it like the most authoritative, mysterious, sacred source of wisdom in ancient Greece, declared that Socrates was the wisest man alive. And Socrates heard this and thought, that's impossible. I don't know anything. I'm constantly confused. I have more questions than answers. How can I be the wisest? So he went on a mission to prove the oracle wrong. He interviewed everyone who was supposed to be wise. The politicians who ran the city, the poets who wrote beautiful verses, the craftsmen who built incredible things. He asked them questions about their expertise, and what he found broke something open inside him. The politicians didn't actually understand justice or governance. They just repeated talking points. The poets couldn't explain what their poetry meant. They wrote from inspiration, not understanding. The craftsmen knew their specific crafts, but they thought that expertise made them wise about everything else. They were all pretending. They were all performing knowledge they didn't have. The only difference between Socrates and everyone else, he knew he was ignorant. They didn't. He was aware of what he didn't know. They weren't. And that's when it clicked for him. Wisdom isn't about knowing more. It's about knowing what you don't know. It's about having an accurate map of your own ignorance. Because when you think you know something you don't, you stop learning. You stop asking questions. You stop being curious. You become rigid, defensive, fragile. But when you embrace uncertainty, when you start from I don't know, you become fluid. You become open. You become capable of actually learning instead of just defending what you already think. This is so counterintuitive to how we're taught to think. We're taught that smart people have answers, that leaders are certain, that confidence means knowing. So we spend our lives accumulating information, memorizing facts, forming opinions on everything, trying to become the person who knows. And it makes us miserable because we're constantly defending positions we're not sure about. We're constantly pretending to understand things we don't. We're constantly afraid someone will expose us as a fraud. And that fear makes us hostile to new information, resistant to changing our minds, allergic to being wrong. Socrates is offering you freedom from that. He's saying, stop pretending. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be certain. You don't have to defend beliefs you inherited without examination. I don't know is not a weakness. It's the beginning of wisdom. It's the prerequisite for actually learning something real. Because you can't fill a cup that's already full. You can't learn something new if you think you already know everything. Think about the last argument you had. Were you trying to learn something, or were you trying to win? Were you genuinely curious about the other person's perspective, or were you just waiting for your turn to talk? Most of us are in constant defense mode. We've staked our identity on certain beliefs, and any challenge to those beliefs feels like an attack on us. So we fight. We argue. We double down. And we learn nothing. We just become more entrenched in positions we're not even sure are true. What if you tried the Socratic approach? What if next time someone disagreed with you, you said, I don't know. Help me understand your perspective. What if you made I could be wrong your default instead of I'm right and you're stupid? Watch what happens. Either you'll learn something you didn't know, or you'll understand your own position more clearly by having to explain it. Either way, you win. Socrates knew this. That's why he loved being proven wrong, because it meant he'd learned something. It meant he was less ignorant than he was before. But here's the subtle part that most people miss. Socrates didn't say knowledge is impossible. He didn't say we can't know anything. He said false certainty is dangerous. There's a huge difference between I don't know as an excuse and I don't know as a starting point. One is intellectual laziness, just giving up on trying to understand. The other is intellectual courage, admitting you don't know so you can begin the real work of finding out. And here's the paradox. The more you embrace, I don't know, the more you actually learn. The more you admit ignorance, the wiser you become. Because you're not wasting energy defending false certainties, you're not filtering information through the lens of what you already believe. You're open. You're receptive. You're actually paying attention to reality instead of just trying to confirm your existing worldview. This is the first and most important lesson. Wisdom begins with admitting ignorance, not as a statement, as a practice, as a way of life. The second lesson is maybe even more confronting. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates said this at his trial. It's probably the most famous thing he ever said besides, "I know that I know nothing." And it sounds harsh. It sounds judgmental. Who is he to say what life is worth living? But here's what he actually meant, and once you understand it, you'll never see your life the same way again. He's not saying your life has no value if you don't philosophize. He's saying, if you're not actively questioning your beliefs, your desires, your fears, your values, if you're just living on autopilot, doing what you've been told to do, wanting what you've been told to want, then you're not really living. You're a biological machine executing someone else's programming. You're a character in someone else's story. You're alive in the technical sense, but you're not truly living. You're not experiencing life as a conscious, free, self-directed human being. You're sleepwalking. And a life spent sleepwalking, Socrates argued, is barely distinguishable from death. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this. How much of your life is actually yours? How many of your goals did you consciously choose versus absorb from your culture? How many of your fears are based on actual threats versus inherited anxiety? How many of your beliefs did you arrive at through examination versus just accept because everyone around you believed them? If you're honest, really honest, the answer is probably uncomfortable. Most people never examine their lives because it's terrifying. What if you discover you don't actually want what you've been chasing? What if you realize you've been living for your parents' approval, or your culture's expectations, or your younger self's dream that no longer fits? What if you discover that the person you've been presenting to the world isn't who you actually are? That's painful. That requires grieving. That requires letting go of so much. So we avoid it. We stay busy. We distract ourselves. We numb out. We scroll. We binge. We work. We do anything to avoid sitting with the question, is this life actually mine? Socrates is saying that avoidance is the real tragedy, because you can spend your entire life climbing a ladder only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. You can spend decades pursuing success only to achieve it and realize you don't even want it. You can build a whole life based on shoulds and supposed tos only to wake up at 50 or 60 or 70 and realize you never actually lived. And by then, so much time is gone. The examined life is different. It's uncomfortable. It requires constant vigilance. It requires regularly stopping and asking, why am I doing this? Is this actually what I want? Is this who I actually am? Is this how I want to spend my limited, precious time on earth? And those questions are painful because sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes you realize you're on the wrong path. Sometimes you realize you need to make big changes. And that's scary. That's destabilizing. But here's what Socrates understood that most people don't. That discomfort is the price of freedom. That pain is the birth canal of authenticity. Because once you start examining your life, once you start questioning everything, once you start living consciously instead of automatically, something shifts. You stop feeling like life is happening to you and start feeling like you're happening to life. You stop being a passive recipient and become an active creator. You stop living someone else's dream and start living your own. Let me give you a practice right now. Stop for a second. Think about your last week. What did you do that was truly yours? What did you do because you genuinely wanted to, not because you thought you should, or because someone expected it, or because you've always done it? What percentage of your time was spent on things you consciously chose versus things you did on autopilot? If that percentage is low, if most of your life is being lived unconsciously, that's not a judgment. It's just information. Information that Socrates would say you need to act on. Because every day you spend sleepwalking is a day you can't get back. The examined life doesn't mean you need to become a philosopher. It doesn't mean you need to spend all day questioning everything. It means you regularly pause and check in. It means you don't let years pass without asking whether your life reflects your actual values. It means you're willing to course correct when you realize you've drifted off track. And yes, that requires courage. Yes, that's uncomfortable. But Socrates is saying the alternative is worse. The alternative is getting to the end of your life and realizing you never actually lived it. Now here's the contradiction. People always bring up, doesn't this lead to constant doubt? Doesn't this mean you can never relax, never trust, never just enjoy life because you're always questioning? And that's a fair concern. But there's a difference between neurotic doubt and conscious examination. Neurotic doubt is anxiety masquerading as wisdom. It's constant second guessing that paralyzes you. Conscious examination is periodically checking in to make sure you're still aligned with what matters to you. One is pathological. The other is healthy. Think of it like this. You don't need to question whether you're hungry every time you eat. But if you realize you've been eating the same meal every day for years because it's habit, not because you enjoy it, maybe it's worth examining. You don't need to question whether you love your partner every single day. But if you haven't checked in on the relationship in months, if you're just going through the motions, maybe it's worth asking, are we still connected? Are we still choosing each other? The examined life isn't about constant anxiety. It's about periodic calibration. It's about making sure you're still driving the car instead of just being a passenger. Socrates lived this so fully that he was willing to die for it. Because once you've tasted the examined life, once you've experienced the freedom of living consciously, living according to your actual values instead of inherited ones, going back feels like death. That's why he couldn't just stop philosophizing to save his life. Because stopping would mean going back to sleep. And to him, that was worse than actual death. The third lesson sounds almost naive when you first hear it. Virtue is knowledge. Socrates believed that no one does wrong on purpose. That if you truly understood something was bad for you, you wouldn't do it. That people only make bad choices because they're confused, ignorant, or misled. And when you first hear this, it sounds ridiculous. Of course people do wrong on purpose. We all make choices we know are bad for us. But Socrates is onto something deeper. And when you understand it, it changes how you see yourself and everyone else. Think about your own life. When you procrastinate on something important, do you think in that moment, this is the wrong choice and I'm going to do it anyway? No. In that moment, you're thinking, I need a break. I'll feel better if I rest first. I work better under pressure. I deserve to relax. You're justifying the procrastination. You're telling yourself a story where it makes sense. You're confused about what will actually serve you. Same with overeating. When you reach for that third slice of cake, you're not thinking, this is objectively bad for me and I don't care. You're thinking, I deserve this. It's been a hard day. One more won't matter. I'll start my diet tomorrow. You're mistaken about the consequences, or you're prioritizing short-term comfort over long-term well-being, or you're using food to meet an emotional need it can't actually meet. You're confused. Same with lashing out in anger. When you say something cruel to someone you love, you're not thinking, I want to damage this relationship. You're thinking, they hurt me first. They need to understand how I feel. They deserve this. You're confused about whether hurting them back will actually make you feel better. You're confused about whether this is how you want to be in relationships. Socrates is saying, if you truly, deeply understood the full consequences of your actions, not intellectually, but viscerally, in your bones, you choose differently. The person who eats themselves into diabetes doesn't really understand deep down that this is what's happening. If they could feel the future disease in their present body, they'd stop. The person who lies doesn't really understand that they're destroying trust, that they're making themselves into someone they don't want to be. If they could feel the long-term cost, they'd tell the truth. This completely changes how you approach change. Most people think change is about willpower, about forcing yourself to do things you don't want to do. And that's exhausting. It's unsustainable. It doesn't work. Socrates is saying change isn't about willpower. It's about clarity. It's about truly seeing what's happening, about understanding the real costs and benefits, not the ones you tell yourself. If you want to stop a bad habit, don't beat yourself up. Don't try harder. Get curious. Ask, what do I think this is giving me? What am I actually getting from it? What am I not seeing about the cost? What don't I understand yet? The clearer you see, the easier the choice becomes. This is why therapy works. Not because the therapist gives you willpower, but because they help you see patterns you couldn't see before. They help you understand why you do what you do. And with understanding comes the natural capacity to choose differently. Let me give you an example from my own life. I used to check social media constantly, like dozens of times a day, and I'd tell myself I should stop, that it was wasting time, that it was making me anxious, but I kept doing it, and I'd feel weak, like I had no self-control. Then I got curious instead of judgmental. I asked, what am I getting from this? And I realized I was checking for validation, for likes, comments, proof that I mattered. And then I asked, is this actually giving me what I want? And I realized, no, the validation is fleeting. 5 minutes after getting a like, I need another one. It's never enough. It's not meeting the real need, which is to feel valued and connected. Once I saw that clearly, really saw it, not just intellectually understood it, the behavior changed naturally. I didn't need willpower. I just didn't want to do it anymore because I saw clearly that it wasn't serving me. That's what Socrates meant by virtue is knowledge. The clearer you see, the more naturally you align with what's actually good for you. Now, the obvious objection, what about addiction? What about trauma? What about mental illness? What about people who genuinely know something is destroying them but can't stop? And that's fair. Socrates' model is incomplete here, but the core insight still holds. Even in addiction, there's confusion. The addict knows on one level that the substance is destroying their life, but on another level, they're confused about whether they can handle the pain without it, whether they deserve better, whether life is even worth living sober. The work of recovery is partly gaining the knowledge, the deep, visceral understanding, that they can survive without the substance, that they deserve health, that there's life on the other side. Same with trauma. Trauma survivors often make choices that seem self-destructive from the outside, but from the inside, those choices make perfect sense. They're trying to stay safe in ways that made sense in the past, but don't work anymore. Healing is partly about gaining new knowledge, new understanding of what's actually safe, what's actually happening now versus what happened then. It's about updating your internal model of reality. So Socrates is saying most of our suffering comes from not seeing clearly. And the solution is clarity, not judgment, not willpower, not trying harder, just seeing more clearly. And how do you see more clearly? By questioning, by examining, by being willing to look at what you don't want to see. That's the work. That's the path. That's how you become virtuous. Not by forcing yourself to be good, but by understanding clearly enough that goodness becomes natural. The fourth lesson is the one that changed everything for me, the Socratic method. Questions over answers. This is the practical tool, the technique, the actual methodology that Socrates used to help people think clearly. And it's so simple it sounds like nothing. But it's the most powerful thinking tool I've ever encountered. Here's how it works. Instead of telling people what to think, you ask them questions. Instead of arguing with their conclusions, you ask them to explain their reasoning. You ask them to define their terms. You ask them to notice contradictions in their own thinking. You lead them through questions to discover truth themselves. Because people don't resist their own insights. They only resist other people's conclusions. Socrates would start with a simple question. What is justice? And the person would give an answer. Justice is giving people what they deserve. Oh, okay. And what do people deserve? How do we determine that? Well, good people deserve good things. Bad people deserve bad things. How do we know who's good and who's bad? By their actions. But what if someone does bad actions for good reasons? Are they good or bad? It depends on their intentions. So justice is giving people what they deserve based on their intentions. But how do we know someone's intentions? Can we ever really know what's in someone else's heart? And on and on. Each answer reveals a new question. Each certainty, when examined, becomes uncertain. This isn't about trapping people or making them feel stupid. It's about helping them think more clearly. It's about revealing assumptions, exposing contradictions, distinguishing what they actually know from what they've just accepted. And the magic is, when someone discovers a contradiction in their own thinking, they can't unhear it. It changes them. They grow. Now, here's what's powerful about this in your own life. You can use the Socratic method on yourself. And this is genuinely life-changing. Pick a belief you're certain about right now. Anything. Write it down. Now ask yourself, why do I believe this? Write down your answer. Now ask, why is that true? Write that down. Keep going. Why is that true? How do I know? What evidence do I have? What would change my mind? What am I assuming? What don't I know? Most beliefs collapse around level 3. You'll hit either circular reasoning, I believe it because it's true, and it's true because I believe it. Or you'll hit, I don't know. And that's not failure. That's success. Because now you know where the solid ground ends and the assumptions begin. Now you can examine those assumptions. Now you can decide whether you want to keep believing something just because you've always believed it, or whether you want to examine it further. But the Socratic method isn't just for yourself. It's revolutionary in conversations. Next time you're in a disagreement, try this. Don't argue. Ask questions. What do you mean by that? Can you help me understand? What led you to that conclusion? What would change your mind? Have you considered this alternative? And mean it. Be genuinely curious, not passive aggressive. Not asking questions to trap them, but asking questions to understand. Oh, watch what happens. One of two things will occur. Either they'll reveal a perspective you hadn't considered, and you'll learn something, or they'll realize their own position is shakier than they thought, and they'll soften. Either way, you both win. Either way, you're thinking more clearly. Either way, you're moving toward truth instead of just defending your turf. I've used this in my own life in every domain. In relationships, instead of saying, "You're being dismissive," asking, "Do you realize how that comment landed for me? Can you help me understand what you meant?" In work, instead of saying, "That's a bad idea," asking, "What problem are you trying to solve? What alternatives did you consider? What could go wrong?" In parenting, instead of saying, "Don't do that," asking, "What do you think will happen if you do that? What are you trying to accomplish? Is there a better way?" The questions do several things simultaneously. They slow down the conversation. They create space for reflection. They invite the other person to think instead of just react. They shift from combat to collaboration. Because you're not telling them they're wrong, you're exploring together whether there might be a better answer. And people are so much more open to that. People are so hungry for that. We're all exhausted from everyone telling everyone else what to think. Socratic questioning is different. It's respectful. It's humble. It assumes you might be wrong and they might be right. Or you might both be partially right. Or the truth might be something neither of you has seen yet. And here's the beautiful part. The more you practice this, the better you think, because you internalize the questions. You start asking them automatically. You catch yourself making assumptions. You notice when you're being certain about something you don't actually know. You become your own Socrates, constantly examining, constantly questioning, constantly refining your understanding. And that makes you wise. Not because you know more, but because you know what you don't know and you're actively working to understand better. The fifth lesson is inscribed on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and Socrates made it his life's mission. Know thyself. 3 words, 2,000 years of philosophy trying to unpack what they mean. And here's what they mean. Most people live their entire lives as strangers to themselves. They know what they're supposed to want, supposed to feel, supposed to be. But they don't know what they actually want, actually feel, actually are. You think you know yourself. But answer this. Why do you want what you want? Not the surface reason, the real reason. Why does rejection hurt you so much? Why does criticism trigger you? Why do you procrastinate on certain things but not others? Why do you repeat the same relationship patterns? Why do you feel anxious in situations that aren't actually dangerous? If you can't answer these questions clearly, you don't know yourself. You're operating on autopilot, running programs you didn't write, responding to stimuli in ways you don't understand. Self-knowledge isn't about your personality type or your favorite color. It's about understanding your patterns, your wounds, your triggers, your values, your fears, your defenses. It's about knowing what drives you at the deepest level, because you can't make good decisions without self-knowledge. You can't build a meaningful life without knowing what matters to you, really matters, not what you've been told should matter. You can't have healthy relationships without understanding your attachment style, your communication patterns, your childhood wounds that get activated in intimate relationships. Here's a practice I use. Every time I feel a strong emotion, I pause and ask, what is this really about? And I don't accept the surface answer. Someone cuts me off in traffic and I'm furious. Surface answer. They're a bad driver and they disrespected me. But if I dig deeper, why does that bother me so much? What is it about being disrespected that triggers such rage? And if I'm honest, it goes back to childhood, the feeling invisible, to a father who'd never acknowledged me. The rage isn't really about the driver. It's about a 40-year-old wound that never healed. Or I'm anxious about a presentation. Surface answer, I might mess up and look foolish. Deeper. Why is looking foolish so terrifying? What does that mean about me if I mess up? And if I'm honest, I'm afraid it means I'm not enough, that I'm a fraud, that people will see I'm not as competent as I pretend to be. The anxiety isn't about the presentation. It's about a core belief that I'm inadequate. And I've been working my whole life to disprove that belief. And any evidence that confirms it feels like death. This is self-knowledge, not surface stuff, deep patterns. And the more you understand these patterns, the less they control you. The more you see them clearly, the more you can choose whether to follow them or not. That's freedom. Not being controlled by unconscious patterns. Not being run by childhood wounds. Not reacting automatically to triggers you don't understand. But here's the thing. Self-knowledge is never complete. You're not a puzzle you solve once and then you're done. You're a process. You're constantly changing, constantly discovering new layers, constantly finding new rooms in the house of yourself. Socrates knew this. That's why he kept questioning, kept examining, kept exploring until the day he died. Self-knowledge isn't a destination. It's a practice. It's a commitment to staying curious about yourself, to refusing to settle into a fixed story about who you are. People ask me, but can't too much self-examination make you self-absorbed, self-obsessed? And yes, absolutely, if you do it wrong. If you're examining yourself to avoid living, to avoid taking action, to stay stuck in analysis paralysis. But that's not what Socrates meant. He meant know yourself so you can live authentically. Know yourself so you can make conscious choices. Know yourself so you can show up in the world as who you actually are, not who you think you should be. This is radical in a culture that's constantly telling you who to be, that's constantly marketing to you, shaping your desires, creating anxiety to sell you solutions. Self-knowledge is how you resist that. It's how you stay sovereign. It's how you build a life that's actually yours instead of just consuming a life someone else designed for you. The sixth lesson is maybe the hardest. Be a gadfly. Discomfort as love. Socrates called himself a gadfly, an annoying insect sent by the gods to sting Athens into consciousness. His job wasn't to make people comfortable. It was to wake them up, to irritate them out of their complacency, to disturb their sleep. And he did it out of love, not cruelty, because he knew comfortable lies kill you slowly. Uncomfortable truths set you free. We live in a culture that prioritizes comfort over growth, validation over truth, niceness over honesty, and it's killing us. We're so afraid of conflict, so afraid of making people uncomfortable, so afraid of being judged that we never say what's true. We never ask the hard questions. We let ourselves and others stay asleep. And we call that being kind. We call that being respectful. But Socrates would call it something else. Cowardice dressed up as politeness. Real love sometimes means making people uncomfortable. Real love sometimes means asking questions they don't want to answer. Real love sometimes means not letting them off the hook when they're lying to themselves. Because if you really care about someone, if you really want what's best for them, sometimes you have to be willing to be the gadfly, to sting them awake, even if they hate you for it in the moment. Think about the people in your life who've helped you grow the most. Were they the ones who always validated you, always told you what you wanted to hear, always made you feel comfortable? Or were they the ones who challenged you, who called you out when you were full of it, who asked you the questions you were avoiding? I guarantee it's the latter. The people who loved you enough to make you uncomfortable. The people who cared more about your growth than your immediate comfort. Now, there's an art to this. You can't just go around being an asshole and call it being a gadfly. There's a difference between challenging someone from a place of love and attacking them from a place of ego. Socrates challenged people to help them see more clearly. He wasn't trying to humiliate them or prove he was smarter. He was genuinely trying to wake them up. That's the difference. The intention matters. And you have to be a gadfly to yourself first. You have to be willing to make yourself uncomfortable, to ask yourself the questions you're avoiding, to challenge your own excuses, to notice when you're bullshitting yourself, because that's where real growth happens. In that uncomfortable space between who you are and who you're becoming. In that gap between what you're saying and what's actually true. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid discomfort, and in doing so, they avoid growth. They avoid authenticity. They avoid life, because life is uncomfortable. Truth is uncomfortable. Growth is uncomfortable. And the more you run from discomfort, the smaller your life becomes. Socrates is saying, stop running. Turn toward the discomfort. Be the gadfly. Sting yourself awake. And if you love someone, be willing to sting them too. Not to hurt them, to wake them up. The final lesson is the one that requires the most courage. Death is nothing to fear. At his trial, Socrates said that death is either nothingness, peaceful, like dreamless sleep, or it's a transition to another realm where he can continue asking questions, maybe even question the great thinkers of the past like Homer and Hesiod. Either way, why fear it? And fear, he argued, comes from pretending to know what you don't know. We fear death because we think we know it's bad, but we don't actually know anything about it. We've never experienced it, so why are we so certain it's terrible? This sounds like denial, like Socrates is just trying to make himself feel better about his execution. But he's on to something profound. Think about what we actually fear about death. Usually, it's not death itself. It's the idea that we'll miss out on life, that we'll leave things undone, that we won't have time to do what matters. But notice that fear is actually about how you're living now. If you're living fully, if you're doing what matters, if you're saying what needs to be said, if you're loving who you love, then death loses its sting. Because you're not postponing life. You're not waiting for someday. You're living now. Socrates could drink the hemlock calmly because he'd already been living as if he might die tomorrow. He'd already said what was true. He'd already lived with integrity. He had no regrets. He wasn't thinking, if only I had one more year, then I'd finally. He'd already done it. He'd already lived fully. So death wasn't a tragedy. It was just the natural end of a life well lived. Now, I'm not saying you need to be morbid. I'm not saying you should walk around thinking about death all the time. But there's something powerful about occasionally remembering that you're going to die, that your time is limited, that one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 50 years, but definitely one day, you won't be here anymore. And when you really let that sink in, it changes everything. Here's a meditation. Imagine you have 1 year to live, just 1 year. What changes? What do you stop caring about? Probably the small stuff, the grudges, the need to be right, the social media drama. What do you start doing? Probably the things you've been postponing, the trip you've been planning, the conversation you've been avoiding, the apology you've been too proud to make, the work that actually matters to you instead of the work that just pays bills. Now here's the truth that Socrates wants you to face. You don't know you have a year. You might have 50 years. You might have 50 minutes. None of us knows. So why are you living like you have infinite time? Why are you postponing what matters? Why are you staying in situations that drain you? Relationships that don't serve you, jobs you hate, lives you don't want. Not forever. Just for 1 more year. Just until this thing happens. Just until you feel ready. Socrates is saying, you'll never feel ready. There will never be a perfect time. And one day, you'll run out of time. And the tragedy won't be that you died. The tragedy will be that you never really lived. That you spent your precious, limited, irreplaceable life being careful, being safe, being appropriate, waiting for permission that never comes. The reason Socrates wasn't afraid of death is because he'd already been living fully, authentically, courageously. He'd already said yes to life. So death wasn't taking anything from him. He'd already had it. And that's the gift he's offering you. Live fully now. And death becomes just an epilogue instead of a tragedy. Now, all of this sounds good in theory, but how do you actually do it? How do you live a Socratic life in 2025? How do you take these ancient ideas and make them real, practical, livable? I'm going to give you 3 practices, 3 things you can start today, not to become Socrates, but to become yourself. The first practice is the daily examination. Every night before bed, spend 5 minutes asking yourself 3 questions. Just 3. First, what did I do today that I'm proud of? Not proud in an ego way, proud in a values way. What did I do that aligns with who I want to be? Maybe you had a hard conversation you'd been avoiding. Maybe you chose honesty over comfort. Maybe you showed up for someone even though you were tired. Write it down. A sentence. Let yourself feel it. This isn't about being perfect. It's about acknowledging when you're aligned. Second question. What did I do today that I'm not proud of? Again, not to beat yourself up, just to see clearly. Maybe you snapped at your partner. Maybe you procrastinated on something important. Maybe you gossiped. Maybe you went through the day on autopilot. Write it down. Look at it. Don't judge it. Just notice it. Because you can't change what you don't see. Third question, what did I learn about myself today? Maybe you noticed a pattern. Maybe you discovered a trigger. Maybe you realized something you thought you wanted doesn't actually matter to you. Maybe you surprised yourself. Write it down. This is how you develop self-knowledge. This is how you stay conscious. This is how you examine your life. That's it. 5 minutes. 3 questions. Every night. And I know what you're thinking. I don't have time for that. But that's exactly why you need it. Because you're so busy living that you're not noticing what you're living. You're so caught up in doing that you're not aware of being. And over time, that creates a life that's just happening. Events occurring, time passing, but no consciousness, no presence, no examination. This practice creates space. It slows you down. It makes you conscious. And consciousness is the prerequisite for change. You can't change what you're not aware of. You can't grow without reflection. So tonight, literally tonight, get a notebook, physical or digital, and answer those 3 questions. It'll feel awkward at first. You'll want to skip it. You'll tell yourself you're too tired. Do it anyway. Make it non-negotiable, like brushing your teeth. This is hygiene for your soul. The second practice is the question habit. Once a day, ask someone a Socratic question, not to trap them or prove you're smart, to genuinely understand them better, to help them think more clearly, to deepen the relationship. Examples. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? What would it take to change your mind? What's driving that feeling? Why does that matter to you? And here's the key. Actually listen to the answer. Don't plan your response while they're talking. Don't wait for your turn. Be present. Be curious. Let them think. Give them space. Most conversations are just 2 people waiting for their turn to talk. Be different. Be the person who's actually interested in understanding, not just in being understood. This does 2 things. First, it makes you a better thinker. You start to notice loose reasoning, unexamined assumptions, emotional reactions masquerading as logic in yourself and others. You become more skilled at distinguishing truth from opinion, evidence from assertion, reasoning from rationalization. Second, it deepens your relationships. People feel seen when you ask them real questions. Most people go their entire lives without anyone being genuinely curious about what they think, how they think, why they think it. Be that person. Watch what happens. Start with one relationship. Your partner, your friend, your coworker, your kid. Next conversation, try one question. Just one. Help me understand what you mean by that. And really listen. See what happens. You'll either learn something surprising about them, or they'll realize they haven't actually thought something through. Or you'll have a conversation that feels different, deeper, realer, more connecting. And that's worth 5 seconds of courage. The third practice is the belief audit. Once a month, put it in your calendar. Pick one belief you hold strongly and examine it. Really examine it. Write it down. Then ask, where did this belief come from? Did I consciously choose it, or did I absorb it from my parents, my culture, my peer group, my trauma? What evidence do I have for it? Not evidence I can Google. Evidence from my own experience. What evidence contradicts it? Have I been ignoring information that doesn't fit? What would I need to see to change my mind? Am I even open to changing my mind? Or have I staked my identity on being right about this? Am I holding this belief because it's true? Or because it's comfortable? Because it serves me? Or because I'm afraid to let it go? Be ruthless. Pretend you're Socrates interrogating yourself. Don't let yourself off the hook with easy answers. Most of your beliefs aren't yours. They're inherited from your parents, your culture, your trauma, your algorithms. You've been collecting them since childhood without examining them. And now you're walking around carrying all this weight, beliefs, assumptions, fears, desires that you never consciously chose. This practice forces you to examine what you're carrying. And some beliefs will survive the audit. When you examine them, they hold up. They're based on evidence, They serve you. They're actually true. Those you keep, but some won't survive. You'll realize they're based on nothing. Or they made sense when you were younger but don't fit anymore. Or they're actively harming you. Those you let go. You thank them for whatever purpose they served, and you release them. And suddenly you're lighter. Suddenly you're freer. Suddenly you're living from your actual values instead of inherited ones. This is terrifying at first because you'll realize how much of your identity is built on beliefs you don't actually hold. You've been performing, playing a character, and now you're looking behind the mask. It feels like dying. But on the other side, freedom, clarity, a life that's actually yours. So right now, think of one belief you're absolutely certain about. Maybe it's political. Maybe it's about relationships. Maybe it's about yourself. Maybe it's about how the world works. Write it down. And this week, audit it. Go through the questions. See what happens. You might surprise yourself. These three practices, daily examination, question habit, belief audit, these are how you live a Socratic life. This is how you turn philosophy from abstract ideas into actual practice. This is how you become conscious instead of automatic. This is how you examine your life instead of just living it. And over time, this changes everything. You start to know yourself. You start to think clearly. You start to live from truth instead of from habit. And that's what Socrates spent his life teaching. That's what he died for. That's the gift he's offering you across 2,400 years. Now, before we end, I need to tell you something important. Something Socrates knew that will change how you move forward from here. You are not broken. You're not behind. You don't need to become someone else. You just need to stop pretending. Stop defending beliefs you didn't choose. Stop chasing goals you don't actually want. Stop performing for people who aren't even watching. Stop living someone else's dream and start living your own. The examined life isn't complicated. It's just honest. It's asking yourself every day, is this mine? Is this true? Is this me? And when the answer is no, having the courage to let it go. That's it. That's the whole thing. Socrates didn't have a system. He didn't have a 5-step plan. He didn't have a course to sell you. He just had one commitment: to never stop questioning, never stop learning, never stop growing, even when it made him unpopular, even when it got him killed, because he'd tasted something, real wisdom, real freedom, real life, and he couldn't go back. You've tasted it too. Right now, in this video, you felt that spark of recognition when I talked about the cave, the shadows, the pretending. When I talked about living on autopilot. When I talked about defending beliefs you don't actually hold. That spark? That's your soul saying, yes, this is what I've been hungry for. This is what's been missing. This is the truth I've been avoiding because it's uncomfortable, but also because it's liberating. So here's what I want you to remember. Write this down if you need to. You don't need more answers. You need better questions. You don't need more confidence. You need more honesty. You don't need to know everything. You just need to admit what you don't know. The unexamined life isn't worth living, but the examined life is terrifying, messy, uncomfortable, and free. You're not here to be certain. You're here to be alive. And that means questioning everything, including this video, including me, including yourself. That means being willing to be wrong. That means choosing growth over comfort. That means living consciously instead of automatically. And here's the thing about Socrates that gives me so much hope. He was just a guy. He wasn't special. He wasn't chosen. He wasn't born wise. He was short, ugly, poor, married to a woman who thought he was ridiculous. He had no advantages. What he had was commitment, a commitment to truth, a commitment to consciousness, a commitment to examining his life and helping others examine theirs. And that commitment changed the world. It created Western philosophy. It influenced everyone from Plato to modern psychology. It's still relevant 2,400 years later. Not because he had special knowledge, but because he had courage. The courage to question everything. The courage to admit ignorance. The courage to live according to truth, even when it cost him his life. You have that same courage available to you right now. You just have to choose it. You have to choose to examine your life instead of just living it. To question your beliefs instead of just defending them. To know yourself instead of just performing yourself. To be a gadfly to yourself and maybe to others. To live fully now instead of waiting for someday. To choose truth over comfort, growth over safety, consciousness over sleep. And if this resonated with you, if something in you woke up a little or got uncomfortable or felt seen, I want you to do something for me. Leave a comment. Tell me which lesson hit you hardest. Was it, I know that I know nothing? Was it the unexamined life? Was it the cave? Was it virtue as knowledge? Tell me which practice you're going to try. The daily examination, the question habit, the belief audit. Tell me where you're still confused, where you're still stuck, where this doesn't make sense yet. Because confusion is the beginning of wisdom. Questions are more valuable than answers, and I want to know what you're thinking. And if you want more of this, more philosophy that actually matters, more tools for living consciously, more permission to be honest instead of impressive, more conversations about how to think clearly and live authentically, subscribe. Hit the bell. Join this community of people who are committed to waking up, to examining life, to refusing to stay asleep. Because that's what we do here. We ask questions. We examine life. We challenge assumptions. We refuse to accept comfortable lies. We choose uncomfortable truth. Socrates would be proud of you for watching this, for being curious, for being willing to be unsettled, for spending 80 minutes examining ideas that might change how you see everything. That's not common. Most people would rather scroll, would rather numb out, would rather stay comfortable. But you didn't. You chose consciousness. You chose examination. You chose growth. Now go. Live it. Question everything. Starting with yourself. Examine your beliefs. Know yourself. Be a gadfly. Wake up and help others wake up too. Not by telling them what to think, by asking them questions, by being curious, by refusing to let them or yourself stay asleep. That's how you honor Socrates. That's how you live a life worth living. That's how you become free. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to think. Thank you for being courageous enough to question. Now go live an examined life. It's terrifying. It's uncomfortable. It's messy. And it's the only life worth living.